share my screen with everybody, and then we'll get going on talking. Resume. There we go. Okay, sorry, I actually stopped the recording. So let me just share my screen, and then we're going to get started talking about framing quotations and a move that we're going to be making that's really important throughout this class and in the next essays, where we're going to be practicing it for the first time. So I passed out this week on our module. We should have the reading from a book called They Say, I Say. It's a book that I used to require in English 1, but in an effort to make things cheaper for the semester, I got rid of requiring that book, and I just give out some different sections of it. If you've read it already and you like the tone of the book, I have actually some extra copies of it, I think here, if not in my office. I think soon I'm going to be allowed to, request to go into my office. I just got my first round of my COVID vaccine yesterday. And so I think that it'll be easier as we start getting vaccinated to get on campus and get stuff. But if you like the tone of the book, I can either copy you some additional chapters, or I can even send people, if there's someone that wants one of these books, a copy of the book, because a lot of times publishers will give me books to try to get me to adapt them to different classes. So I actually have quite a few copies of They Say, I Say, but it's a nice book because it really kind of moves through these moves of how to incorporate outside text into your ideas. And we talked about that last time, just with the paraphrasing and quoting and why we use outside sources in our papers. And so I think this book makes some nice moves, but especially the chapter of it that I think is the strongest one is the chapter that focuses on framing quotations. And that's the one that I copied for all of you that's on Canvas under this week's module. So we'll be referencing that throughout this little mini lesson. But if you haven't read it yet, this will still make sense, but I really recommend to go back through and look at it, even if you kind of skim through different sections, things like that, because there's some pretty useful sentence starters in there. And then there's also some different kind of transitions or ways to think about incorporating analysis or examples in your writing. So think about this idea of why do we quote or paraphrase outside sources, right? We talked about that last week. What were some of the reasons that we kind of came up with different ideas of why it's effective to quote or paraphrase in our own writing?
It helps you support your ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. It helps you support your ideas. Good. Any other reasons why you'd want to quote or paraphrase? That's really good. It helps you support your ideas, or maybe a little bit more detail into what that could mean to support one's ideas. I'm seeing some stuff pop up in the chat. Let's see. Yeah, they can bring up emotional response, right? That works really well. So yeah, you can support your ideas. You can bring up some emotional response, right? You can find writers who maybe have a way of articulating something that is building on your idea, or vice versa, right? You could take a writer's ideas, and then you could take that quote or take that paraphrase and then build on that with your own personal example. So it really it fortifies our writing, right? It makes our writing stronger. It helps us just add weight behind our ideas. And remember, last time we talked about this idea also, that just because you're using a quote in an essay doesn't mean that you have to agree with it. You can also disagree with what a writer is saying. And we'll make some of those moves, especially into our third essay, where we're going to be bringing up counter argument, because I think it's a really helpful thing that we'll be doing, especially getting ready for the research project at the end of the semester. So, I don't know why it skips twice. All right. This is one of the things that comes up in the book, They Say, I Say. So this looks like a real bummer. Has anyone here ever been the victim of a hit and run? Or maybe come outside, come out to a car, hopefully not as bad as this case where your new Tesla is trashed, right? But situation where something hits you and there's not really a lot that right? Kaja sounds like she has. I remember one time when I was teaching this the first time in one of my in-person classes, one of the students was like, I made the mistake of not saying a victim of a hit and run. I said, anyone ever been in a hit and run? And someone raised their class like, yeah, I hit someone's car once and I just sped off in the middle. I was like, yeah, maybe don't tell us that in class, right? But this idea of a hit and run, right? Like think about the situation, the information that you're left with, right? What kind of information are we left with after a hit and run? Kaja, when you had your hit and run, what information were you left with? Just waiting for it to pop up into the chat. Yeah, saw the driver and the car, but they wouldn't pull over, right? So other than that, you're really, yeah, but that's about it, right? So you saw the driver in the car, but they wouldn't pulled over, and that's about it. So really, you're left with nothing, right? You're left with no meaningful information, right? Just like this dude in the picture. He's got his hands in his pockets, right? His posture is kind of bummed out, but there's no information. There's no, here's my insurance. There's no, here's my phone number, give me a call and we'll get this fixed, right? You're left with virtually nothing. And that's one of the ideas that comes out when we're looking at the book They Say, I Say, is they label these ideas hit and run quotes, right? And so when we're looking at the chapter of They Say, I Say, and let me just go to it really quick and I'll show you an example of where that comes from. I'm just going to bring up the copy of this chapter. Let me share my screen with you really quick. So here's this chapter from They Say, I Say, right? And I'm going to show you an example of a hit and run quote in Trevor Noah's book. But if you look through here and you start kind of scrolling through and looking for the different sections, down in here in page 2, they give an example of what it means to have a hit and run quotation. There's a little car like running over some Play-Doh, right? But they really define this idea of a hit and run quotation as a quotation that's put into text, right? And it's kind of dropped in there, but there's no real so what behind why that quote is there. There's no information that you're giving the reader. So in other words, like you're meeting the requirements of the assignments, you're saying like, here's this quote, but then you're not really interacting with it. And that's your responsibility as a writer, right? Because some people just like, I don't know, we could watch the same TV show and I could love it and you could hate it. Or we could watch the same movie and you could love it and I could hate it, right? It's open for interpretation. And the same thing happens when we're looking at text. When we look at somebody's argument, when we think about the ideas that people are presenting, I could read something in a very different way that somebody else can. And I think it's important to start thinking about these readings where we get away from this idea of right and wrong when it comes to reading a text, right? Like, I mean, there are situations where like there is a right and wrong answer. Yeah, like if I were to say like, what time period in South Africa was Trevor Noah growing up? And if you were to say like, oh, in the late 2000s, after apartheid, I was like, oh, that's not correct, right? I mean, so there's like fact right and wrong. But when it comes to, drawing your own conclusions in a text, there's not really a right and wrong answer, right? Like in any other situation where something would be preference or something would be interpretation, I can't tell you the answer is wrong if you like a painting that's on your wall and I don't, right? And so that same idea happens when we're thinking about how to utilize quotes in text, is that it's really important for you to think about the reader may not be reading this thing the same way that I am. They may not have the same conclusion that I have as they're looking at these ideas. So it's important for you as a writer, to make sure that you're drawing the conclusion for your reader. And I'll show you some different examples of that. Okay, so let me go back then. So if you go through this chapter, I would just recommend, I'll reference back to this, but definitely reading through this section here where it talks about the importance of framing every quotation. And it's really not that long of a reading. It's only like 7 pages. And so it's pretty straightforward. And there's, some of these pages are filled up with little pictures and stuff like that. So it'll read pretty quickly. So let me go back to this presentation and then I'll show you some examples of hit and run quotations in writing. Okay, so back to present. There we go. All right, so this guy is kind of stuck, doesn't know what's going on, right? And here's the same example of that happening in text. So here's a Trevor Noah quote, right? Trevor Noah states, "We tell people to follow their dreams, but you can only dream about what you can imagine. And depending on where you come from, your imagination can be quite limited. I think this is a really important idea. What's wrong with me doing this in my writing?
You're not explaining why is it important.
Exactly, right? There's no analysis. There's no reason why I think this is important. I'm just telling you I think it's important. I'm not really interacting with this idea at all. So this is a perfect example of a situation where like, here is a really strong quote, right? Yeah, not enough explanation I see coming up in the chat, right? There's no explanation at all happening there. It's a great quote. It's one of my absolute favorite passages of Trevor Noah's book, but I'm not doing anything with it as a writer, right? I just move on to another idea. Another impact of stereotyping is, and then I'm just hitting and running, right? Just like that person that smashed into Kaja's car, I'm just taking off into the night, right? And it's that same idea when it comes to hit and run quotation, is that I'm giving a quote, something's happening, but I'm not doing anything with it. And so now what we have to think about is this idea of framing quotations. And this is what the authors of They Say, I Say label this is framing quotations. And I like that idea of thinking about framing, right? Like if you take a poster and you just kind of like hang it on a wall or put a picture on a wall, right? Like with a thumbtack or, you know, a nail or a piece of tape or whatever, it looks unfinished, right? It doesn't look complete. But then if you put that same poster or that same picture in a frame, like it looks super fancy, right? Like I remember when I made that transition, like as I started to get older from like, well, I don't know, when I was in college, I would have just like a poster on my wall and just kind of put thumbtacks in it and hang it on my wall in my apartment or whatever. And then it was like later on, I remember like having the same poster that I wanted to hang up in the apartment that I got with with my wife now, and like hanging it up, and she'd be like, that needs a frame. And then you put a frame on it, you're like, oh, it looks pretty good, right? Like it finalizes things, it makes things presentable. And I think that's probably why they call this idea like framing quotations. And I'll give you some other analogies to think about it. But in the art of quoting, these two authors, right, they argued that as a writer, it's your responsibility to show quotes in a way that your reader knows why this quote is relevant and how it's connected to your argument, right? That's really important. Like your reader should not have to come to those conclusions by themselves, right? And if we think about that idea, we talked about that way early on with paragraph development. It's like, don't assume that your reader knows exactly what you're focusing on. Because in this case, I have no idea, or you may not have no idea what direction that I'm going to be going with that idea and that Trevor Noah quote. Similarly, if we look at like the last papers, I have no idea why the relationship that you may have had with a, you know, teacher in high school was really supportive, or why, you know, an experience that you had with a grandparent was really motivational in your educational journey. Like you have to explain that to me. Same thing with this paper. When you pull out a quote, you have to explain it to whoever your reader is. So your reader cannot assume that quotes speak for themselves, right? An idea doesn't necessarily speak for itself. An idea requires interpretation. Make sure that you're analyzing your ideas so that your quote or your paraphrase and how they connect to your writing is clear to the reader. Like that's the crux, or kind of like the main point of the They Say, I Say chapter, is that it's your responsibility as a writer, because we cannot assume that somebody is going to read something the same exact way that we are. And we can't assume that they're going to have the same conclusion about the text that we're providing in our essays. Any questions about that so far?
I just have a little question.
Sure.
We can use like personal examples or experience to
Mhm.
explain the code.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's a lot of times like a personal example can really relate to what a quote is, right? That you could find a specific quote and it could really make you think about an experience in your life. And that would be a perfect example of where you'd be able to do that.
Yeah,
That's a really strong way of interpreting it.
that's a good example of showing like why this quote is relevant to you and your argument. Yeah, I think that's a great example.
And kind of a pitch for class English 2 as an option when you're done with English 1, is that's really one of the ways that many of us teach English 2. Like when I do teach English 2, which I don't think I'm going to in the fall, but in the upcoming semester, hopefully once we get back to campus, I'll be teaching it. But the idea is like, that's one of the things that's really powerful about literature and about reading, is that we can take something that was either written a long time ago or written by somebody with a completely different background than us or live in a different place or whatever, and we can find personal connection to it, right? Like hopefully as you're reading through Trevor Noah's book, even though he grew up in a different country, on a different continent, maybe at a different time, from a different culture, from all these differences, there's a lot of similarities that we find, right? There's moments in his book when I'm reading it and I was like, oh, that reminds me of an experience that I had with my mom. Or that reminds me, like, especially when he starts talking about like his first date, I was like, that reminds me of an experience that I had, right? Like there's all these moments that like, that bring us together as people, right? That like we had to have these shared experiences. So I think that's a really powerful way to think about this, is that you could give a quote that's about somebody else's idea and somebody else's experience and connect it to your own personal experience and draw that connection there. So now we're going to start talking about like how we frame quotations, right? Like the moves that we need to make to frame quotations. So it's kind of a 3-part thing, right? And I think that's a good way of thinking about this, is to think about this in the same way that you would paragraph development, right? Like the same way that we would as we developed out well-developed body paragraphs with the tell me, show me, so what. It's a very similar move to that. So the first part of it, you want to think about introducing your quote or paraphrase, right? Like that's the first piece that the reader should know, right? For example, like be able to have some context for the quote that you're using. So this is important. The first time that you use a writer, give the writer's first and last name and the title of their work, right? So I should know who's writing it the first time through. After the first time through, then I'll know who you're talking about. So like, for example, if you say Trevor Noah, let's assume the very first time you say Trevor Noah, I may not have read his book. I may not be familiar with his work. I could be a reader outside of this class. And if you're like Trevor Noah states, I'd be like, well, who's Trevor Noah? Right? I have no idea who that is. But if you say in his book, Born a Crime, Trevor Noah states, now I'm good, right? And you can even give a little quick overview of what the book is about if you want to in a sentence. That's what's called a synopsis. It's just a quick little, it is book about growing up in South Africa during apartheid. Trevor Noah argues, blah, blah, blah. And then there's the point that you're making, right? But it's really important that you give the reader context. After you give the reader context, let's say you quote Trevor Noah 3 times or quote Adichie twice or whatever. After you do that, then you could just refer to the writer by their last names. We're on a last name basis with our writers, right? Like it's a formal relationship. So like he's not Trevor to us, he would be Noah, right? And same thing with any other writer that you use over the semester. First time you use a writer, and this is true of any class, right? Like first time you use a writer, first and last name. After that, then just refer to the writer by their last name. So I would refer to William Shakespeare as Shakespeare in my papers. I wouldn't call him Will or Bill or, right? We're not buddies, right? Like he's Shakespeare. And so I would call him by his last name. And that's true of any writer that you use in this class. So also make sure that you give a quick little brief explanation or overview of the text or of the topic, just to give a little context for the quote, right? Like you want to make sure that the quote doesn't just kind of hit the reader out of nowhere. Like you're kind of, here's some introduction, here's some ideas you need. In the same way that if you were to explain this quote, like let's say you were reading something and you found a quote in a book you really liked, and I don't know, maybe you're like sitting on your couch and someone at home is like, you're like, oh, this quote's really good, listen to this. You read it out loud to them, you're like, this is from a book called Born a Crime by a guy named Trevor Noah. Like you would give them a little bit of context, right? It's the same idea here. So that's the first part of framing your quotation. The next part of framing your quotation is to give the quote or paraphrase, right? Make sure that you use in-text citations, right? So that's important. We talked about last time, just those little parenthetical in-text citations. Same idea. So when you give the quote or paraphrase, think of that as kind of like the body. You've introduced it. Now here comes the quote or the paraphrase. The last part of it is really important. Analyze the quote or the paraphrase. So think about this idea as, how does this writer's ideas connect to your argument that you're making in this paragraph? Without this, that's the hit and run quotation, right? Like this is exactly why that idea is there, that like you need to explain it for your reader, because without this, the reader has no idea what this means, why it's there, what the significance is of this idea. All 3 of these are your responsibility as a writer. It's like, here's context for the quote, here's the quote, and then finally, so what? Why am I including this in my essay? How does this relate to my paragraph? How does this relate to my argument? How does it relate to my life? Whatever it is that you're focusing on. Any questions at all?
Yeah, what would you say is like the the ratio you should see of these three things.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, like, I think it just depends on the job you're doing. But I would say, like, you could get the introduction done in a sentence or two. The quote is as long as the passage. Remember last time we talked about this idea of quoting enough so it feels like a good bite of food, right? Like, you don't want it to be overwhelming, so you don't want to quote like a whole page, and now it becomes, or even a whole paragraph. Now it becomes clear why, because you have to analyze it, and you're not analyzing this whole entire thing. You're analyzing enough that you could really kind of sink your teeth into, right? So I would say, like, the first step would be maybe a sentence, 2 sentences, something like that. Next would be, as long as the quoter section is that you're using, I would say the majority of the work that you're going to be doing, the biggest ratio is going to be in your analysis, right? Like, that's where the bulk of it's going to be. So it's not really like a third, a third, a third. It would probably be like 50% of the development, at least what I would say would be analyzing the quote, analyzing the sections you took there, because that's your original writing. The rest of it is just introduction to the quote and the quote. That's not really your thoughts. That's just like setup, and then here's someone else's idea. Part 3, that framed analysis of the idea, that's your original thoughts. Those are your original ideas, right? And that's your deep diving analysis. So I would say the bulk of the writing, as you think about each of these frames, maybe 25% for 1, 25% for 2, and then 50% for 3. It's a really good question. Thanks, Chris. So here's a good way of thinking about it, right? Also, because In-N-Out is like one of my absolute favorite things in the world. So if you're vegan, like my brother was in this class, then I'm sorry, but I always think about food in analogies for classes, as I've talked about multiple times. And here's an easy way to think about it, right? If you were to go to In-N-Out, and In-N-Out is one of those places that, like, especially In-N-Out is between Solano College and my house. So when I'm driving home from work, or not as much to work if it's early in the morning, but when I'm driving home from work, it's like the scent of it makes me feel like my car just like naturally wants to pull into the drive-through, right? Like, but if you were to go to In-N-Out, right, and someone were to just think about the quote as the kind of the important thing that a hamburger is delivering, right? The quote is like the meat and the cheese section of the double at In-N-Out, right? But if I were to go to In-N-Out and I were to just go through the drive-through and they were to hand me just meat and cheese and spread or whatever the sauces they put on the burger, and just hand it to me in my hand, it'd be a mess, right? It'd be a disaster. I'd be confused. Honestly, I would eat it, right? But it would be an awkward situation, because the quote on its own is not enough. That meat and cheese by itself in a burger is awkward without the delivery system, right? That's the bun. That's the whole rest of it all put together, right? So if we think about this idea of like a quote sandwich, the quote is what we want to deliver, whatever's in your sandwich, right? If you're, don't want to go for some sort of meat-based sandwich, if you're eating a falafel, if you're eating whatever, right? Like, that something in the middle of what you're delivering, that's the thing that you want to get to yourself, right? That's the thing that kind of we think about as like the most important thing. If I went to In-N-Out and they forgot to put tomatoes on my hamburger, well, I'd be happy because I don't really like tomatoes. But like, let's imagine I did. If they forgot to put tomatoes on my hamburger and I got home, I would eat it and I'd be okay. But if they forgot to put meat in my hamburger and I got home, I'd be like, I need to go back and I need to get a new one, right? Because the most important thing is missing. Same idea with the quote. Like, that is the important thing that you're delivering. So think about it as the introduction is kind of that top bun, right? It's important. It needs to be there, because without that, you're just resting your hand on nonsense, right? The quote obviously needs to be there because that's the thing you're delivering to yourself. And then the analysis kind of ties it all together. So a framed quote, or a well-crafted sandwich, or a well-crafted hamburger, or whatever the case is a great delivery system. It's a way of presenting something to somebody in an easy to manage way, right? And so I think, like, the analogy, like, a lot of instructors will talk about like creating the quote sandwich, or creating the frame, or creating whatever. And I've always liked the example of the quote sandwich, because I think it's just an easy way to think about it, to visualize what you're trying to do. Introduce an idea, give a clear quote, give a clear paraphrase, right? Like, here's an idea that I think is important. And then finally, so what? Why is this so important? Why does it matter? Oh, back. Okay. So now we're going to talk about how we'd fix this hit and run quote, right? So we're going to go back to the same idea. Trevor Noah states, we tell people to follow their dreams, but you can only dream about what you can imagine. And depending on where you come from, your imagination can be quite limited. I think this is a really important idea. So now that we've got some context for what a hit and run quote is, and some kind of context for what we should be doing, it's pretty clear how we can fix this, right? So what do we need to do to fix this passage? What are some things we need to do to fix this?
We need to add the analysis, like connect it to our argument.
Yes, right. Add analysis, right? I see the chat, more development on why it's important. Absolutely. So add analysis, show why it's important. Anything else? What about the beginning of the sentence? Anything we need to do there?
You need to introduce it.
Exactly. I need to introduce it, right? You need to know who Trevor Noah is. So here's an example. Now here is a framed version of this quote, right? In his book, Born a Crime, Trevor Noah argues the impact that single story perception can have on an entire group's sense of self-worth, right? This light blue section in here, that's my quote introduction. We know what the name of the book is, we know who Trevor Noah is, and we know what he's writing about. Now here's his quote in yellow. Noah states that we tell people to follow their dreams, but you can only dream about what you can imagine. And depending on where you come from, your imagination could be quite limited. So now I have top bun, I have meat and cheese and all that good stuff, but now I need the bottom bun, right? And so here comes some analysis. This is now my thoughts on what he has to say. Noah's argument illustrates how people in his neighborhood have internalized the stereotype and others' low expectations of them. This is especially detrimental because it has affected their mindsets, limiting their ability to socially progress. So now the earlier question, I think maybe Maria had this question about like, can we use our personal experiences? This would be a great opportunity where if I were to keep writing, just because I don't want to have you read like an entire paragraph or essay that I write here, but if I were to keep writing, now is where I would tap into this with a personal experience. So as a kid, I've witnessed the same thing happen in my neighborhood. Growing up in an environment where, and then I could just dive into this, right? I could start giving specific examples of what my environment was like when I was growing up. So when I read this quote from Noah, it made me think about what people's dreams were, right? And depending on where you come from, your dreams being limited. So the way that I analyze that quote is that he says that like neighborhood and the way people stereotype each other lets people kind of internalize these low expectations. So in other words, people just don't believe they deserve more. And so that makes me think about my neighborhood that I grew up in, right? Like the elementary school that I went to, the apartment building that I lived in Fairfield where I was growing up, right? Like living in Fairfield, if you're familiar with Fairfield, like I grew up on San Marcos Street and then later moved over to San Jose Street and went to a school called Anna Kyle. But it was like that neighborhood, like a lot of my friends growing up as they got older were in gangs, there was never any talk to us about college. There was never even really any talk to us about like school other than like sit down, be quiet, kind of go through the motions of school. And so like I would write about this, for example, that like we grew up in an environment where I felt like there wasn't really a lot that was expected of us. And there wasn't really much other than like, get a job, maybe the idea of like being successful was like maybe getting like a car that someone thought was cool, but it certainly wasn't go to college. It certainly wasn't, get a career that we wanted. Like there was never any talk about that, right? And so like I would say as a result of that, many of my friends and I like were just kind of disenfranchised with school, right? Like we didn't really care about it the whole time we were going through school. We didn't really connect with our teachers through high school. And so it was just kind of one of those things that I felt like was the environment since I was a little kid, and it carried all the way through high school until, luckily I found Solano College. And so I would say like, whatever your example is of this, maybe you can think about a different experience, right? Maybe you can think about a different example that you have personally. Maybe you can think about a different way that you could personally connect to, because you could have a situation, maybe yours is the exact opposite, right? I think about that growing up in situations where like, if people think more about somebody else, then your dreams can just fly, through the ceiling, right? Because people believe in you, they support you. So maybe that's an experience that you had. But the reality is like whatever it is, however you interpret this, this would be a great example of where you could put a direct quote, right? Where you could put a direct quote and then you could put in a personal experience to think about how your personal experience relates to this idea and how you can personally connect to this idea. Any questions on this so far? Any general questions about framing quotations before we take a look at practicing one together? So let's take a look. All right, so here's a Noah quote. If you're racist and you meet someone who doesn't look like you, the fact that he doesn't speak like you reinforces your racist perceptions. He's different, less intelligent. So here's a Noah quote, right? And what we're going to do is we're going to practice framing this. So I'm going to take this quote and then I'm going to open it up in a different document and we're going to look at it together. So here's what I want us to think about first. I would just read this again, and I want you to start, as I'm creating this Word document that we're going to kind of play around in, I want you to think about what you think this means to you. If you're racist and you meet someone who doesn't look like you, the fact he doesn't speak like you reinforces your racist perceptions. He's different, less intelligent, right? So we're going to think about how we could interact with this idea, right? What it means to you is the very first place to get started. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen now. Now I have it set up in a Google Doc, and we're going to work through one together and just kind of take some different ideas and try to frame this quotation and think about how we could possibly interact with this, what kind of ideas we could use to our own experiences, what kind of ways we could develop this, right? So let's start with a way to frame this, right? So the first part that we want to do, what's our first step to frame this quote? So let's imagine like this is kind of a good practice to think about when you're writing your essay, right? You're reading through Trevor Noah's book. There's a quote that stands out to you. Maybe in your essay, you're talking about what the problem is with single story. And then you have this idea, you run across this quote, you're like, this could support my argument really well. And now I want to think about how I could put this into a body paragraph. So to get started, what do we have to do here?
Introduce it.
Introduce it. Great. So what's a way that we could introduce this quote? Where can we maybe start to introduce this quote? What do we have to provide? What information do we have to provide our reader with to be able to introduce this quote?
First and last name, book title.
Good. Okay, so let's see. So then, yeah, first and last name and book title, right? So in okay, so in his book, Born a Crime, Trevor Noah, what does he talk about? Like if we were to kind of give a quick little overview of what he's maybe talking about in his book or in this passage, what would we say generally he's talking about in this passage? What is he arguing about?
The impact of language and
yeah,
racism.
exactly. Good. Nice job. There we go. So in his book, Born a Crime, Trevor Noah argues about the impact that language has on racism. He states, and then we jump right into his quote, right? So now you can see in this breakdown, we've introduced Trevor Noah, we've introduced his book, and we've just given a quick little example of what this is about. So far, framing, the introduction is done, the quote is done, right? Now, what we have to start doing is thinking about what does this mean or how we could interact with this idea. So I'm going to give you just 2 or 3 minutes, look at this quote, think about something that you might be able to add into the chat that would be your analysis of what this quote is, maybe before we start moving into giving a personal example. So think about how you would analyze this quote, what it means. Okay, go ahead. Okay, once you think you have some ideas, just start tossing them in the chat, and I'll kind of copy and paste some stuff into Google and see what we come up with. There's no wrong answers. Just take a shot at it. I mean, however you interpret this quote is the way that you interpret it, right? Like there's no right and wrong way necessarily of reading this. It could just be a sentence. Anyone have any ideas yet? I'm still waiting for some stuff to pop up in the chat so we can start jumping into building this frame.
So I feel like I agree with the statement, or at least that it makes sense.
Good. How come?
So it just seems to, well, let's see. I guess I have experienced this idea. For instance, when I worked in an oil refinery, we had engineers who came from, all over, and they were born in different countries, and so English being their second language, they couldn't always communicate to us exactly in a way that we understood.
Yep.
And I would hear people and maybe even sometimes myself, at least originally until I got to know them more. That people would like make fun of them and say that they don't know what they're talking about. But these were engineers. These were people who
Right.
had degrees and, you know, were considered experts in their field. But they didn't speak English the way, you know, we speak English because we've been speaking it our whole lives. And so they were considered less intelligent, I guess. But they absolutely knew more about, you know, like a pump engineer knew more about the inner workings of a pump than I did, just because I operated it and troubleshot it. Like whatever I knew how to do probably came from research that, you know, his field created, you know?
Good. Absolutely. So that's a perfect example, right? So you can see what I wrote is just kind of a general bit of analysis of what you said first, right? Like so analyzing the quote, I just wrote, paraphrase what you said, people can start to believe that those who do not speak English as their primary language may not know what they're talking about or be less intelligent because of the way they speak. And then if you're giving your personal example, then you could say, for example, when I worked at the oil refinery, and then you could just start diving into that example. There were engineers that were there, right? They had this different idea. And so that idea, you'd be able to dive in and start using your personal experience to be able to back that up. Does that make sense?
Yep.
That's a perfect example that you could write about if you were focusing on single story perception that people have. This idea that someone may not be as intelligent because they have an accent or because of the way that they, you know, that English is not their first language. Like I also teach ESL classes, and like a lot of times when I talk with my students about this, like a lot of people experience this, but the reality is like I have students that speak 5, 6, sometimes 7 different languages, English being one of those, who are incredibly intelligent. But for some reason, we do have this bias that if someone doesn't speak English as a native English speaker, that all of a sudden people are like, does this person know what they're talking about? I mean, like my physician is not a native English speaker, but I trust that she's a high quality doctor who knows what she's talking about when I go to see her, right? And so I think there's this reality though that we could all throw in these different examples. Maybe some of this, how we're judged, maybe it could be the slang that we use, maybe it could be people around us, but we could think about tons of experiences that we could support this idea with that quote. So I'm going to look at another example from what somebody put in the chat. So good. I'm going to copy this and paste this right in here. So this idea, here's some analysis of this quote, right, that Kaja put in here. And I just copy and pasted this from the chat. So it is reaffirmation to him that not only do they look like him, they don't speak like him, so they have to be different, or in a sense, not on his level. Absolutely, right? So if we think about maybe a situation, I'm sure that we could all think about situations where, for example, I do this thing where sometimes I have to move from my home computer to like my work laptop or one of my kids' Chromebooks or something like that. And it's like, I get really comfortable with like typing on my main computer, and then I move to one, and all of a sudden it's like that tiny little bit of spacing just throws my whole typing off, right? But maybe we could think about a specific example where we could say like, is there an example where somebody would say because someone speaks different, they're not on somebody else's level, right? We could all think about that. I mean, do people have any of those feelings where like they maybe have made it feel inferior because of the way that you speak? It doesn't have to be the language you speak, but it could be like the vernacular that you use, the vocabulary that you use. Like, can you think of examples of that? I can think of my experience, right? And I would write all about, like, I felt really intimidated the first time that I was in a literature class in college, right? Like, when I transferred after I finished Solano, when I went to do my undergrad work at Chico State, when I went there for the first time and I took British literature and I saw some of the kids in there, I was like, I'm really scared, because they were like using bigger vocabulary than I was. I thought they were smarter than I was, right? Like, because I didn't speak the same way they did. Like, I don't know, I was from a different place they were. Maybe I, used different slang that they did. Maybe I was a little bit more informal, but I had like this really kind of like intimidation towards those students. I felt like maybe they were viewing me as less intelligent. Maybe they were viewing me as like, it turned out to not be true, but in my mind, it were like, these are the smart kids, and the way these kids are talking is way smarter than the way that I can talk, right? And I still have that. Like, if I'm in a meeting, sometimes there's people that like use all these really big words, and I'm like, it took a little while for me to feel confident, would be like, this is just the way that I talk, and that's, I don't need to use big words all the time or have this certain tone to be taken seriously, right? But I'm sure we all have different versions of that, where we can feel less, we can feel different because of the way that we speak, the language we use, things like that.
So a personal like example is I was raised in the 80s, and my dad was born in the 40s. And one of the things that he drove into me growing up was he used to have this saying that no one should be able to determine my race over the phone. So he would like, he would correct my English like constantly, and based on like what he understood like proper English to be,
right?
And then I would go and hang out with like my friends, and I would speak the way that I was taught to speak at home, and then I'd be made fun of for speaking like that, for sounding white. And so what happens is you develop this thing that we call code switching. I don't know if everybody knows the term, but
yeah,
like,
tell us a little bit about that.
Black people, we have a thing called code switching, where we speak one way in certain certain environments, and then we speak totally different in other environments. Like the way we speak at work isn't the way we speak at home, or so as I got older, it's a lot of work, like doing that. Like, I don't think people really think about it much. Like it does become like a natural thing, but it does take a lot of energy, like, going back and forth. And as I got older and I learned a little more about things like language and like what we consider proper English hasn't always even been what was considered proper English, and how the way we speak is typically used as a way to separate us in the classes. I stopped code switching as much. Like in my job when I was new, and I've worked in a lot of environments where I was the only Black person, because of, like, in the Navy, I was in operations because I scored really high, and as an operator in an oil refinery, I went to a unit that didn't have very many Black people because it was a specialized unit, because I'd scored really high in that too. And so initially, when I was younger, like, I spoke a certain way so that everybody would feel comfortable around me. But as I got better at my job and made promotions, like, I felt like I shouldn't have to do that as much. My work should speak for me. And so I just kind of started to sound more like, I spoke more in the way that was comfortable to me. And I discovered that some people started to be intimidated by me in a way that they weren't previously, and it did tend to cause issues in my work. And my resentment just made me continue to do what I wanted to do, regardless of whatever the long-term consequences of
Mhm.
my boss's boss being intimidated about talking to me, you know? Uh,
But
so,
I think that's a perfect example, right? Like, I mean, you could
Yeah.
use that, and Kaja has that connection in there also. She said that was like her previous job, is like that could be your paper. I mean, just the way you're brainstorming that out right now, right? And I hope that other people who are in here are kind of thinking about their own personal experiences that relate to what these writers are talking about, where it's like you could have a whole paper that structures this idea of like, you know, I could see like an early body paragraph about like what your dad's concerns were. And a lot of times, like, you know, I grew up, my dad is Mexican, and my mom is white, and then my friend has the same exact family breakdown. And I speak, you know, it's not perfect, but I speak fluent Spanish because it was important for my dad to teach me Spanish. My friend doesn't speak a word of Spanish, and the reason is because like his dad didn't want him learning Spanish because whereas my dad saw it as a strength, his dad saw it as you're going to be judged negatively if you're speaking Spanish around people, right? Because of his life experience. So there's not really a right and wrong. It's just like what your dad's experiences were the reason that he made that decision, right? And I think that if we think about that code switching is something that we all do, right? Like, I mean, I code switch when I'm talking to my kids versus when I'm talking to you versus when I'm talking on the phone to one of my buddies, right? But I think that there's also like a code switching that we have to do, like you're talking about, or like Kaja's talking about in the chat, where like we have to do that as a way to adapt. And then later, if we're doing it because we feel that we're forced to, code switching can also be something that we do as powerful. Like now, I view code switching as a skill where I could say, if I'm in a room with the right people, I can use the right language as a form of leverage, right? I can put on my academic voice if I have to, and I could talk the talk with a certain group of people, even though it's not me, it's a role that I could play. And so I think that like what we're starting to see is that we took this one quote, right? And we could think about all these different personal experiences, and then we could hear Anthony's story tie into this quote. That's the idea that we're doing as we're framing quotations, is that like these quotes are planting a seed, right? This one idea planted that seed. And you can see how if Anthony were to start writing out based off of what his ideas were there and his experiences were, there's all these different ideas that can build from there and can dive into a really well developed essay where you're exploring something pretty heavy and pretty deep and having a lot of room to be able to analyze that. Are there questions at all about how to start making these moves? Because this is what we're going to be practicing for our homework this week. And this is, to me, this is the most important move in English 1, right? Like this is what we're really, really focusing on, right? Like, can you pull ideas from a reading and explore those ideas and analyze those and think about your own experiences and how they relate to those ideas, or someone else's experience and how they relate, right? Like it's taking ideas and analyzing those and interacting with those to be able to strengthen your own writing.
Yeah. Well, I can think of an example from the other side of that, of like growing up, like using the language in my household that I would hear in like academic settings and stuff, and how that has, in a way, created this perception that like the languages that aren't the ones that I grew up with are somehow like other, that they aren't like, they don't fit in that academic setting because that's what I've always heard. So that's definitely like another perspective you can cover in that same like idea of like code switching and everything. Anthony, I thought that was a great point. So yeah, that's absolutely the kind of stuff to like bring in here. And I thought you brought up some really great points, as Jose said, that you could like really flesh out a paper with.
And we're going to look at examples of code switching too. And our next paper, one of the directions you can go specifically is looking at language. But I think you can do it in this paper too. But that's what Trevor Noah talks about a lot, is like his ability to be able to like, you know, he'll explore this throughout his book. Like that he's this, at first it's like him being half black, half white is a crime, right? Like it's something that he views to the point that you know, it's reinforced that it's illegal. And he can view it as a weakness. But we're going to see examples in his paper or in his book where he talked about like how much of a strength it is, where he becomes this chameleon, right? He becomes this person who's able to like move back and forth between these different worlds, and language has a massive role in that, right? So this is the move. Like I said, we're practicing this for a homework. I'll be hanging out, but if you have any questions when you're working, just you can shoot me an email, like you can stop in and talk to us in office hours. But really the big thing is for this homework assignment this week is finding some quotes that you can interact with, and then practice framing these quotations, right? Like introduce the idea, give the quote, and then finally that analysis behind the idea. So essentially what we're doing throughout this homework assignment this week is creating these body paragraphs that we can later on take and incorporate into our essay. So last time I wanted you thinking about or this time, the last homework assignment, what essay prompt you were going to be exploring. Now, what quotes would you be using to support this essay prompt? So these homework assignments we're working on this week are really important because you're essentially building your essay kind of a little step at a time, right? So that when we start writing the essay, you're already going to have your prompt, you're already going to have a lot of your brainstorming done that you've done with building ideas and interacting in the discussion with each other. And then you're also going to have some quotes and some frames that you're going to be able to just drop right into your essay as you're building it.